But let's go 1 Timothy 3. Well, I'll just start reading verse 1. It is a trustworthy statement. If any man aspires to the office of overseer, it is a fine work he desires to do. An overseer then must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, temperate, prudent, respectful, hospitable, able to teach, not addicted to wine or pugnacious, but gentle, uncontentious, free from the love of money. He must be one who manages his own household well, keeping his children under control with all dignity. That's as far as we'll go on this. And I cut it short because I didn't know we were going to have this discussion. Then I was like, well, we probably do need to have this discussion because it hopefully would be good for us. So I hope nobody feels any contentiousness towards one another in that.
I can't stand that anymore.
That's understandable.
I was the one you were supposed to stand.
But here's the thing. Let's go over this review. Let's not get back into this. The pastor, the office of the pastor is what we've been looking at. Remember, first we had the calling that you must be called to be a pastor, and that doesn't mean like God called me on my phone here. He gets that internal call, that desire that's given to you that I don't want to do anything else with my life but to be a pastor. And we looked at how we'd call that the internal call, right? That you have this desire to be a pastor, but you also need the external call. The external being the church desires you to be their pastor, right? But if you don't have an external call, you don't have a church to be a pastor over. Which should teach us to not be rogues and just go out and start our own churches. We dealt with the title of the pastor, and we saw that the pastor, elder, bishop, overseer, under shepherd, they're all the same person, the same office, just different names for the same office. And each one of those names, each one of those titles describes a different portion of the office, but it's still the same person. We saw that it was a work. That it says it is a trustworthy statement. If any man aspires to the office of overseer, it is a fine work he desires to do. So if you sitting there today and you say, I feel called to the pastorate, you feel called to work. It's a fine work you desire to do. It's not, I feel called to the pastorate because I can make this much money and I really only have to speak for like 1 hour a week. I only have to do something 1 day a week. I only work 1 day a week and I get a salary and a house. It's you desire the work of the pastorate. Not also, I just want to be up there in front of people teaching. I would just want to teach people. I want to be a teacher. I think I should be heard, right? If that's your attitude, you ought not to be in a pastorate. I'd say, honestly, that the man for the pastorate should be one that almost feels undeserved. I shouldn't be up here teaching because I'm not really different than you. Like, we're all going through stuff, right? We all struggling. And I don't think my knowledge is way up here and yours is way down here, and I must give you some of my knowledge. It's one that's saying, come alongside me. Maybe my knowledge is up here and yours is down here. That it doesn't matter. I'm to come down with you and come alongside you to do the work of the ministry. And notice once again, to do the work of the ministry. It's work. We saw the past qualifications that we saw. He must be above reproach, the husband of one wife. He must be temperate, prudent, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not addicted to wine or pugnacious. Notice it says pugnacious there. I dealt with it, but I want to go back and because I probably know what it means in the KJV, but I don't know what it means in the NASB. The KJV has not greedy of filthy lucre. So he's not greedy, but gentle, uncontentious, free from the love of money. Now we get into the night. He must be one who manages his own household well. He must be one who manages his own household well. He is one who manages. One who rules is what that means. This is the idea here of standing before. So it comes from a compound where pro histemi, pro means to stand, to be before, to be before somebody's face. To be pro is in front of. Histemi means to stand or abide or continue. So he is to be in front of or continue to be before his household. He's to be in front of his household. This, I believe, to actually entail the idea of federal headship. That the husband, the pastor, is to be one that rules his house well, so he's to be the federal head of his household. If his child's sinning, it's my fault. If my wife's doing something she ought not to be doing, it's my fault. You don't go to her, you don't say something to her, you come to me. This is the idea here. He needs to be before his household. You are responsible for your family. Now, I say this is important. This is why I wanted to bring this out tonight. Because this isn't just true about a pastor. This is supposed to be true of all of us men in here. That we are supposed to be before our families. We're supposed to be, I'm responsible for my family. It's not the pastor's job to come teach my family, and hopefully the pastor preaches the gospel this week so maybe my child can get saved. No, you should be laboring day in, day out that the Lord save your child. The promise is to the men and husband or fathers to raise them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. It doesn't say the pastor to raise them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, even though he should. But the responsibility is on us as men. So, but the pastor should be doing this. If the man's not doing this, he shouldn't be the pastor. You go before your family. You stand before them. Maybe think of it like this. This idea, when you think of somebody's family, they picture you standing in front as the protector, the provider, and the leader. If you're thinking about somebody's family, do you think about the husband standing in front as the protector, provider, and leader? This word could actually be translated as to superintend. Y'all know what that is, right? It's like a superintendent. He's to superintend, to preside over. So this is the picture of the pastor in his home. Let me stop you for a second and just ask you, why do you think this is important? Why would Paul have this as a qualification? That he's one that manages his own household well, one that stands in front of his household and protects, provides, and superintends and presides over. It actually answers it. Go ahead.
It's an example of Christ in the first place of ministry.
It's an example of what?
It's an example of Christ in the first place of ministry.
Yeah. And he tells us in the next verse. Go ahead.
If he can't manage his own household, he can't manage a church.
Yep. That's what Paul says. You just quoted Paul. Next verse there. He says, but if a man does not know how to manage his own household, how will he take care of the church of God? So if you look at a man's household and it's an absolute disaster, he ought not to be a pastor. Now, obviously, there's times when you might looking at, if you're like a peeping Tom, look in the window and see the children being all crazy, the wife screaming, and the husband laying on the couch wore out. But that ought not to be his character all the time, right? There was I was just up in Ohio with some of our friends up there, and if y'all met, some of y'all met Lex before, but he's really one of the calmest, and I think he's a genius, like literally, like he's one of the smartest people I've ever met in my life. But he's like calm. You never see him mad. He's always. But he said we were talking about just being fathers and leaders and husbands. and being good examples. And he said, but then sometimes you might look in and see that it doesn't look that way. When the husband or the father loses his cool. And I'm like, this is coming from him. I've never even really seen him lose his cool. But it happens. It happens to all of us. But the pastor should be one that, for the most part, when you look at his life and you look at his family, it's together. So, Paul answers that question, but he must be able to superintend or to be a protector and guardian of his family if he is to do so over the church. And you can actually see the same picture of a father and a husband as a pastor. Right? Like the pastor is a good picture of a father and a husband. He's supposed to be, right? As a father, you nurture up your children in the faith. You protect them from danger. Be the one whom your children come to for answers. And as a husband, you protect and provide for your wife. You are to love her like nobody else would. And this can and should be said about the pastor. That he should be nurturing up the church with the Word of God. He should be protecting them from heresies and false teachings and false teachers. He's to stand in front of them and protect them. He should care for them, and they should be able to come with him with anything. That's why I wanted to have a discussion tonight. But we all should be able to come to one another. Even though it's a hard discussion, even though sometimes maybe our tempers, and we could say I have complete control of my temper, but sometimes we get these discussions, our tempers go up and down and up and down. But we ought to be able to have them, right? We ought to be able to have them and come back together on Sunday morning and sing praises to God with one another. And we ought to be able to have those discussions and come together on Sunday and have communion with one another. The people should be able to come to the pastor, and the pastor should be there feeding and nurturing the church. And now we know this isn't always the case, because pastors are fallen men as well too, right? Just as fathers and husbands fail at this too, however, this should be the character of the pastor. He's not perfect. And if y'all think that about me, talk to Amanda. There's plenty to be thrown out. But the character should be there. It starts in the home. That's where the pastor starts. See, here's the thing. If you want to be a pastor, you start in your home. You pastor your house. How do I do that? You teach your children. Well, just like organically? No. You actually formally teach your children. You break out the scriptures and you go through the scriptures with your children. Teach them what the words mean. Teach them what these verses mean. Teach them what these chapters mean. Why is Paul writing this book to the Ephesians or to the Romans? And learn that stuff yourself. You ain't to just grow up and then all of a sudden when you hit like 30 or 40, you just jump right into a pulpit. You should have years of practice before that with your family. So he should be able to manage or lead his own household. If he can't do that, he shouldn't be over the church. So let's move on here. It says, he must be one who manages his own household well, keeping his children under control with all dignity. One of the first things I think about when I read that verse are PKs. Y'all know what that is? PKs. Preacher's kids. Or pastor's kids. You know that they have that nickname? Why they have the nickname PKs? Because they're the worst kids in the church. The PKs, they're the bad ones. You know, and sometimes you might even yeah. Sometimes you might even you must be a PK. Because you are horrible. But guess what? If they're that way, they shouldn't be PKs. Because their dads should not be preachers. Their dads should not be pastors. If they're out of control and wild, their dads should not be in the pulpit. if the children are terrible little monsters, he's not fit to be a pastor. That's the qualifications. I don't make them up. This does not mean, though, that their children shouldn't be running around being a little wild like a child sometimes, right? Like, I mean, we can't. That's not what this means. Let me give you an example. I'm sorry, Zach, but I couldn't think of a better one. With your son Levi. It is not sinful for Levi to be running around thinking he's Sonic the Hedgehog. It's not. And that's not what it's talking about. It's not talking about you have a 2 or 3 year old and they like to run around in circles and they're a little wild. Of course they're wild. And it doesn't mean that we should have a leash on our children, right? This is talking about maybe a child's out here running around acting all wild and crazy, but now it's time to sit down and listen. And you say, hey, come over here and sit down and listen. And he says no, and is completely out of control and won't stop at a time. That's what this is talking about. He's uncontrolled at that point, right? We would all agree on that, right? There's one thing with the child running around having fun, and we're all okay with that, and we all love that. But it's another thing when you say, it's time to stop, and they say no, and keep on going. That's what this is talking about. Keeping his children under control. This does not mean that you must be a helicopter parent. I'm sure we've heard of that before, right? You hover over your child and make sure that they have to, almost like like we're trying to be a sovereign God, right? And we overemphasize the sovereignty. Don't go there, you can't go there, you can't do. We aren't to do that with our children. You know, I really like this picture of raising up your children. And this is why I said, even though this is dealing with the pastor, this is dealing with our homes. I like to picture raising up our children like putting bumpers, you know, when you go bowling and they put the bumpers up for the children. It doesn't prevent them from rolling the ball the wrong way. It prevents them from going into the gutter, but it doesn't mean they're going to get a strike, right? And that's why we should raise our children. We have these gutters, these roadblocks on the side. You can go through all this and you can fall, you can hurt yourself, you can get a little wild and crazy, you can have a little extra fun, but you don't go past the bumper. So it's not being a helicopter parent. I actually think that's bad parenting. That might be my opinion, but it's also the other side of the pendulum is equally as wrong, right? This helicopter parent that says, no, I got to have complete control over my child. They must do everything I want them to do all the time. They must say everything I want them to say all the time. And then you swing the pendulum all the way to the other side, and it's the most wild child you've ever met in your life. We actually just met one when we were up in Ohio. This wild child. And here's the thing. It's not the child's fault. That's what makes it hard, because you're like, that kid's really bad. And I want to kind of slap the child. But it's not the child's fault. It's the parents' fault. This is the parents that let the child do everything that they want to do. So you have the one side where they don't let them do anything at all. Then you have the other side where they let them do everything that they want to do all the time. And typically that's the side that the PKs fall into, right? They don't fall into the control every little tiny thing. They fall into they do everything that they want to do. They pretty much do everything that they want to do. There's no control, and this ought not to be the case. There's a little more to this as well. I'm just going to turn there because of time. Titus 1:6. It's talking about qualifications for elders here too. It says, namely, if any man be above reproach, the husband of one wife, does it sound familiar? Having children who believe, not accused of not dispensation. That would be good if it was in the scripture. Not accused of dispensation or rebellion. Let me come up here to. Having children who believe. Listen to John Gill, what he says about this. By faithful children, that's what it says in the KJV, having faithful children. By faithful children cannot be meant converted ones or true believers in Christ. For it is not in the power of men to make their children such. And their not being so can never be an objection to their being elders if otherwise qualified. At most, the phrase can only intend that they should be brought up in the faith and the principles, doctrines, and ways of Christianity, or in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. So this does not mean that if your children are unbelievers, you're disqualified. I'll say this, there's a popular pastor out right now that his child is a professing atheist. His child is also like 20-something years old. But that would not disqualify him from being a pastor, because his child didn't believe. But listen to what the text actually says here in Titus 1:6. Having faithful children, not accused of riot or unruly. So this is a literal translation of this verse. It says, not under accusation of riotous living or insubordinate. So, in other words, they are not excess, is a way you could say this. One way this riotous living could be translated is unsavedness. So, like, not saved. They aren't living like the world. Even if they are unbelievers, even if they don't believe in Christ, they are not living like the world. They're not living unsaved, like the unsaved. They obey their father and mother. And they aren't chasing thing after thing after thing after thing. That's what the world does, right? You're like, well, how can a man stop his child from doing this? How can you stop your child from covetousness and chasing after things and living like the world? Well, children typically learn by example. If we're living insubordinate and riotous lives, it's probably because, if they are living insubordinate and riotous lives, it's probably because they see mom and dad doing it. Maybe not to the extreme the child does it, because that's what typically happens, right? Your child gets your vices and they're just glaring. They take your vice and they bring it up really big in front of you. They get your virtues quietly, right? You don't notice the virtues coming up in your children, but you notice the vices. So maybe you don't have that vice to the extreme that your child does. But if what they see is a quiet and tranquil life, that's content with what they have, and their contentment is found in the Lord. If that's what your children see of the parents, is that's what they see, and that's all they see, they most likely won't go down the road of covetousness. I want this, I want that, I want this, I want that. And when they do go down that road, what do you expect it to do, fathers? Correct, chastise, discipline, whichever is needed. Maybe we could say it like this. The child doesn't run the household. The father does. When it's talking about the pastor. But like I said, that's all of us men. The child doesn't run the household. The father does. I know many don't like this term today, but this is actually patriarchy. That's father rule. That's patriarchy. That's what it's supposed to be. I don't care what anybody says. I don't care when we put this on YouTube if we get banned for using the term patriarchy and said the fathers are supposed to rule our household. That's what we're supposed to do. And as a pastor, you should definitely be doing that. Now, for the sake of time, I could obviously go through scriptures and deal with the patriarchy and how it's actually supposed to be over and over and over again. But let me just mention it like this. Father rule is to be done like Christ rules his church. How does Christ rule his church? With tenderness, with gentleness, with affection, with mercy, with grace, with love. That's the way the Father's supposed to rule. Not with a strong hand of punishment as many fathers do. Not, child, you're going to listen to me because I'm bigger than you and stronger than you. Because one day, guess what? Happened with me when I was a teenager. I was bigger and stronger than mom and dad. Now what are you going to tell me what to do? You've used that you're bigger and stronger than me my whole life. Now what are you going to tell me what to do? Because I'm bigger and stronger than you. That's not how we're supposed to lead. But your kids should listen to you because they know that you love them. And their best interest is at heart, right? Not because I can punch you in, I can knock you in the middle of next week. I've heard that so many times growing up. I can knock you into the middle of next week. Well, now you can't. Now, we're supposed to lead as husbands and fathers and rule and be standing before. But this is a qualification for a pastor. If the pastor doesn't live up to that, the pastor should not be in the pastorate. And as I've said with all the qualifications, maybe not yet. I have the desire. My house isn't in order. I need to get my house in order, right? And then maybe a year, 2 years, 3 years, maybe 10, 15 years down the road, the house is in order. And then you step into the pastorate. So, but it's also not for just pastors, but of all fathers and husbands. But let me close with saying this. We all know that this is a work in progress still too, right? None of us is perfect. You can't look at the pastor and say, I mean, I got cameras in my house and stuff. You couldn't watch those cameras and see Jeremy's perfect all the time, because it's not. It's a work in progress. But the pastor shouldn't be a disaster in his household if he is to be an example and a leader for the church of God. Amen.